Brenda Shadd, of Choctaw and Cherokee descent, brought her heritage into big-time fashion, where almost no one expected to hear an Indigenous voice. By landing spots on runways and magazine covers, she proved that elegance is also about telling the right story, the kind America tries to forget, and she brought others along so more people could see it. Gertrude Three Finger, Cheyenne, ended up in William E. Irwin's archive, a guy who chose to preserve what the country didn't always want to see. From the late 1800s into the early 1900s, he traveled through communities and recorded features, clothing, tools, and rites. If these stories already hit you in the gut right from the start, do one quick thing: subscribe to the channel and hit like. Because from here on, we're going to bring you more portraits like these, with real context, no Hollywood gloss, so this past doesn't disappear again. In 1926, the Siksika elder Bear Bull faces the camera without rushing, like someone who knows exactly where he belongs. The braid across his forehead isn't decoration. It marks his role in protecting a sacred bundle tied to the medicine pipe ceremony. There stands a guardian carrying a duty passed down generation to generation, right at the heart of the Blackfoot Nation, still today. Long Wolf, an Oglala leader known as Shunkmanitu Hanska, disappeared from public talk for a long time, like a lot of Native history does. In 1892, he died in London, on the road with Buffalo Bill's show, far from the plains. When newspapers mentioned his name again in 1997, the cost of fame and erasure was clear. In 1901, Fred E. Miller photographed two Crow women on the Apsayaluk Reservation, Whistler and Hitz, the one who rides the gray horse. It's not just posing, it's real life. The fabric, the posture, the steady gaze. For people looking today, you can feel the pressure of holding on to old ways while the new American century was knocking at the door without asking permission. Around 1900, Iron White Man, an Oglala Sioux, became a featured attraction in Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. Between train whistles and caravan dust, he rode into the arena in front of thousands of folks, and newspapers sold it as an American adventure. Indigenous tradition, blank gunfire and horseback riding turned into entertainment, and the crowd cheered loud. When you step onto a lot or a farm, the ground isn't just dirt. It's where generations worked, paid taxes, buried dreams, and raised a family. Running your hand through the soil reminds you none of it came easy. Keeping that land strong is protecting what's ours, a legacy for the grandkids tomorrow. That's patriotism in real life. Long before textbooks or veterinarians, Indigenous peoples already had a simple rule. Breeding the same bloodlines in dogs over and over causes problems. They traded puppies between villages, looked for animals from far away, and avoided tight inbreeding. That's how, for years, they kept dogs diverse in coat and temperament, ready for work. In 1880, at the Army post called Fort Keogh in eastern Montana, L.A. Huffman placed two Lakota children in an improvised studio near the barracks. They stayed still and looked straight into the lens without fear. The pose lasts seconds, but their gaze makes you think about their lives outside that room and the frontier's future in a truly hard time. In 1953, with her fame at its peak, Marilyn Monroe stopped in Vancouver before heading to film River of No Return. During that stop, she shook hands with Chief Joe Matthias of the Capilano Band, with a reporter nearby writing down every word. It was Hollywood meeting real Indigenous leadership with respect on both sides. In the 1880s, the Lakota leader Spotted Tail, Sintegleska, was squeezed between Uncle Sam's promises and the Brulee's survival. In meetings with government agents, he bargained over reservation boundaries, food, and the right to hunt. Since the buffalo were disappearing and settlers were taking over the plains just to keep his people standing. In 1901, on an ordinary afternoon at the Fort Hall Reservation, a northern Shoshone family gathers before being photographed. How the group is arranged shows family ties, who supports the household, and who keeps the children safe. Behind the silence, you can feel the hard routine and the choice to hold on to their own story on that land. In the early 1700s, the Comanche came down from the mountains and moved into the Great Plains, quickly learning how open territory works. With the horse as both teacher and tool, they set up routes, made alliances, and faced their rivals. From Texas northward, every step became power over travel, trade, and war. In the late 1920s, a northern Cheyenne woman appears on the reservation, steady, leaning on a cane, like someone who lived through changes most people can't even imagine. Her scarf is neatly tied and her weathered hands speak to daily work and caring for family. Her direct gaze says, plain and simple, that her people's memory isn't up for sale. Around 1900, an Oglala woman is photographed calmly, looking at the person in front of her like she's saying, "I know where I come from." What you see there isn't a pose. It's life on the plains, kinship, ceremonies repeated, and everyday rules. That look is a reminder that without each small act, the community doesn't truly move forward. Coming from the Great Basin, the Shoshone became pros at living on the move. Every season changed the plan: light camps, hunting, gathering, and trading with other peoples. When the water dried up, they read the sky and kept going. They crossed mountain ranges into what's now Idaho and Wyoming with Old West songs and prayers, their way to survive. In the 1930s, at a small train stop, an Indigenous mother waits with her son in silence. It's the Great Depression. Tickets cost too much, there isn't much food, and the risk is high. The boy follows the tracks with his eyes. She grips her suitcase and her hope. Nearby, other folks are also trying to find work in another city and start over again. From 1951 to 1963, Chief Dan George led the Tsleil-Waututh on the Pacific coast, trying to hold on to land, language, and customs as government pressure grew. He used poetry and books to be heard beyond the village, and after 60, he went into film, proving that leadership can speak through pop culture without losing its roots. In Northern California, Lucy Thompson grew up by the river, between fishing, ceremonies, and Yurok law passed along by word of mouth. In the early 1900s, she learned English, stood up to authorities, and wrote down her people's myths, rules, and memories. That way, younger generations got a map of who they are, even when others said it was all in the past. In Eufaula, Oklahoma, Tsianina Red Feather Blackstone was born Muskogee and saw that singing could go beyond the stage. In the early 1900s, she brought traditional songs to big audiences, pushed back against unfair laws, and called out racism straight up. She reminded people that the U.S. has a lot of roots, not just one, and that still hits us today. For many generations, the Bannock traveled back and forth across southeastern Oregon and southern Idaho like the land was in their blood. They followed rivers, crossed deserts, and knew where to find game and roots. Every season brought trade, survival lessons, and history passed down through real talk, and that kept the people together, even under pressure. In the early 1900s, the Seneca woman Awe Ayu, called Pretty Flower, carried in her memory her people's journey from near Lake Ontario. Through broken treaties, wars, and losses, they didn't let go of their marks. In the way they spoke, prayed, cooked, and raised their children. She saw a steady identity right there in everyday life. In 1872, an Arapaho man faces the camera with a steady look, and the portrait says a lot more than just a face. He comes from a people who knew the Great Plains, hunted, made alliances, and faced rivals. When government pressure and expansion tightened in, life was forced to change. Even today, researchers go back to this looking for clues. In 1908, Roland Reed photographed an Ojibwe man standing in a canoe in the middle of a lake, blowing a handmade call to lure a moose. The sound fooled it with perfect timing. It wasn't just hunting, it was training passed from father to son with skill, patience, and respect for the forest. It shows how tradition becomes a tool in a no-nonsense way. In 1906, someone from the Caddo Nation appears, and with them comes a piece of an older America before fences and roads. This people built communities in what is now Oklahoma, cared for fields, creeks, and ceremonies. They also traded and kept watch for intruders. The clothing and posture are a reminder that this story isn't dead history. It's a warning to pay attention. In 1870, in a Shoshone community in Wyoming, the war chief's teepee was the day's war room. Scouts and elders met there to read tracts, plan hunting routes, make alliances, and enforce discipline. In the open West, one bad call could bring hunger to camp if the snow came early, and nobody forgot it. In 1898, Hachasnacha, called Little Chief by government agents, carried in his body the weight of decades of choices. In councils and meetings with officials, he tried to hold on to customs and land, while pressure from Washington and settlers closed in. Every meeting could turn into surrender or resistance for his people. In the 1600s, explorers started calling this people the Pima, but they call themselves Akimel o Odom, the river people. In the Sonoran Desert, planting and digging canals was just as vital as praying. The knowledge came from the ancient Hohokam. Everyone knew how to read the seasons and share water fairly. Without flow, history and food disappeared together.